Okay, welcome everybody. Hope you can all hear me. I'm Tricia Dodd. I'm the chair of the RSS Social Stats section. So it's lovely to see all of you here today in some rather opulent surroundings. Unfortunately, I've been told that some people went to the RSS thinking it was on the RSS, so there'll be some people joining us, but I didn't want to wait for them. First, just a bit of information I should give you is that this is being filmed, so I hope you're okay with that. So before we get into the main business of the meeting, just to say that this is the Cathie Marsh Memorial Lecture, so we take a minute to remember Cathie. I was lucky enough to work with Cathie when she did her research on the census back in what was OPCS days. And I think she, well, and me then, if we go back to them, would have been quite surprised that we might come to a point where we were having a debate about whether there was a future for surveys. But I know if she'd been around, if we had had that debate, she would have been very vigorous contributor to that debate. So, and I'm sure we'll have some good contributions today. So I'm just going to go through very briefly the outline of the day. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome Guy Goodwin, who's the Chief Executive of the National Centre for Social Research, and Tom Smith, who's the Managing Director of the Data Science Campus at the Office for National Statistics. And in a moment, I'm going to ask Guy and then Tom to talk for about 20-25 minutes. And they're going to talk one after the other. So, and then we're going to take questions and discussion. So Guy will go first. So if you've got any questions for Guy, kind of store them up until we get to the end. Then we should have a good bit of time for questions, any kind of discussion. And then after that, we've got a drinks reception, which has been very generously sponsored by Sage. And I'm sure we'll have some more vigorous discussions up over a few drinks. So to get straight on with it, can I ask Guy to step up to the podium?
Let me just check, can you hear me okay at the back, yeah? Fine, thank you very much. Today is a great day to be a statistician and a dreamer. And as somebody who can claim to be both, I stand here and I can honestly say I love the census, I love surveys, I love the fact that we are getting into administrative data as a community. I love the progress we're making with business data. I love the fact that we are going to be linking data, doing more modeling. I think it's fantastic that statisticians are going to be the sexiest profession within a decade. And if you think about it, that's only a year and a month away. I haven't quite convinced myself yet that data is the new oil, but I am trying. It is a fantastic time, and I sense a huge optimism. Well, certainly I feel optimistic about the future. But am I right to be, or am I guess, more like Scott Fitzgerald's Gatsby, sort of stretching out towards the green light at the end of Daisy's dock? Now, Tricia very kindly invited me to say a few words about the future of surveys against that backdrop, which is great because we are having our annual tribute to Cathie Marsh. And of course, she was a great enthusiast and promoter of the survey method. Indeed, she wrote a book on the subject. It's also fitting, I think, to be doing this talk a week after this extraordinary, if you like, marquee showcase for a social survey, which was published last week, the National Survey of Mental Health of Children and Young People in the country. It was an amazing survey. It showcases the scale and prevalence of mental health issues, analysable by a formidable range of pre-specified, tailored factors for the customer, from e-cigarette use to social media use to exclusion from school and so on. And of course, the survey has been picked up by a plethora of interested parties and policymakers. But the survey also showed, interestingly, that only a quarter of those children with mental health issues had any contact with a mental health specialist. Almost a half had some form of support, informal support from teachers or whatever. and then a minority had no support, but a significant minority. And the survey, I guess, represented in my mind a wonderful challenge to those occasional siren voices I have in my head that say, just perhaps, in some time in the future, I'm not quite sure when, we could bottle up the complexity of human life and pre-populate it on our social surveys in the same way that we want to with our business surveys or school surveys to sort of make them a source of last resort. It also reminds me of happy, decadent days at the London School of Economics as a postgraduate student, when one of my colleagues used to say that he thought surveys were like Heineken, the Heineken beer. And you might think that's odd, but he used to then say that's because they reach the parts of our lives that other sources can't reach. That's my only joke for today, by the way. Right, so I'm not going to define a survey because I'm not qualified to, in my view, but Cathie, in her book, The Survey Method, which I can recommend for you to read, she had two definitions, and this is the short version, and it's absolutely fine for the purposes of my talk tonight, because it mentions inquiry, it mentions systematic, and it mentions a group, a sample of cases. And I'm going to largely restrict my comments to social surveys. That's the rather complex and inevitably quite expensive type. So, where do I think we are with surveys? I think the reality at the moment is that surveys are increasingly being seen and perceived as unfashionable. They're rather unpopular. I think cost is a key driver in that, but not the only one. I think there's an element of ideology too. And, but I still note that they are being very widely used by customers. So I can give examples to evidence that. The Guardian last month compared 1.3 million UK millennials who use the Revolut bank, if that's how you pronounce it, with 80 to 100,000 Swiss customers who use the bank. And they noted that the pay of the Swiss was more than the UK millennials, and that the costs to the Swiss of normal living costs were less than the UK millennials. And they had a wonderful set of caveats, the Guardian did, before they did the inevitable. They said these weren't produced by Tom and the ONS and National Statistics. They weren't that. They weren't by Eurostat. And don't worry, they are only Revolut customers, so they probably can't be generalized, but we're about to generalize them anyway. And then they said, but importantly, they're not survey data, so few. And they sort of then went on to say, they're actually real transactions from real people. You know? Great. So they then went on and just compared them. The BBC, they comment, I think it was by Hugh Pym, sorry Hugh if it wasn't, but surveys. You know, the real issue with all surveys is they're uncertain and uncertainty. Gosh, who would have guessed? And I'm sure the real problem is the uncertainty is measurable. Oh my goodness, how irritating is that? I mean, so much easier if you just can't measure these things at all and you can just forget about them. So it's just two examples, you know, to evidence really the sort of, you know, vibes I get that surveys are unpopular at the moment. I have two other thoughts about the current, the now, and then I'll come to the future. I think surveys are a real challenge to those people, and I think there are some in our community, who I think of as having a gigantism view of the world. I don't know if gigantism is the right word. I'm thinking of Small is Beautiful, that book. But those that think that the data revolution that we're seeing is going to sweep away everything in its path. So everything that is around or has been around in the past is going to be swept away. So it's quite an exclusion type mentality, rather than my starting point, which is really the integrated sources model, that one day we are going to have an integrated statistical system based on multiple sources. And then the second thing I note currently is the remarkable bond that still continues over the years between the survey researcher and the policy department, which is of course largely based around that the survey can be tailored, the questions can be tailored to what the customer really wants to find out, that you have so much control in a survey and therefore you're very much tailoring it to the customer's needs. So what do I think about the future? Oops, go back. Certainly over the next decade, I would argue that surveys will evolve. I think they will continue to thrive for various reasons, but in a much more congested data space. And I think three things will probably happen. One is that we will actually see different types of surveys collected in new, more innovative ways. We will see a mode change. We're already beginning to see that, and we'll see new use of technologies. And why wouldn't we want that? I mean, it's right that we should be imaginative as technologies change. I think we may well see the repositioning and reclaiming of the survey for social research and social investigation. You know, there's a reason why Moser and Carlton actually called their book Survey Methods in Social Investigation and not, I don't know, survey methods in collecting basic population characteristics in between the 10 yearly censuses because they're not carried out frequent enough and our administrative data are a bit naff. It would have been a long title, but actually there has been something about how we've used the survey which is sort of in a continuous population survey type mode. So the reason why we put religion on the labour force survey was not because we were really inquisitive about the labour market by religion. It was actually because the LFS was the biggest survey and we needed to collect the numbers by religion in the inter-census period. And so I think there is an argument that says, actually, if you're just collecting mainly basic characteristics on your survey data, then at some point I'm going to pre-populate you in the future as our administrative data and other sources become more sophisticated and more accurate. So there is something about the survey as an instrument for social inquiry. The third element, I think, is the ability to link survey and longitudinal study data with administrative and other data sources. And I think it adds vastly to their richness. At NatSem, we have got some examples, and I can talk about it later as need be. But I think we tend to believe that we should be linking administrative data and administrative data because they're relatively similar, without realizing that actually the benefits are in difference. And so actually linking survey and administrative data, I think, will happen in the future and will significantly add to our business case as a community. So for those of you who are a little bit cynical about the future of surveys, and I expect there are one or two in the audience, I have a challenge. I mean, I tried it, and it didn't really work for me, but hey-ho. Take one of our large complex national surveys and split it, the variables in it, into three categories. Any one, those you think we can pre-populate or fill in now, those we are likely to be able to do so in the future, say the next decade or next few years, and those where we may struggle. You see, I'm an optimist, so I put almost everything in the center category when I tried one of these, but it's anecdotal, and I think you should try and see, or we should have a systematic review. Because I was interested by how many things I sort of hovered over the third category, and then thought, no, sometime in the future we'll be able to do it. but it is quite a challenge. And of course, the more things that it's difficult to do, the more likelihood, of course, that surveys will continue to fill a really important gap, or those really important gaps in our sources. I was interested at the recent UK Data Forum, which I chair, that there was a paper that was talking about surveys and the future of surveys in it, and said surveys will be used in the future to collect data on our attitudes, opinions, and fears. Really? What a strange thing to think surveys are for the future. And I think sometimes it's actually useful just to use an example to sort of illustrate why surveys are so much more at the moment than that. So I've picked on health, and this is not an unbiased list. I asked Anne Connolly, a fantastic researcher at NatZen, to just come up with a list of some of the things she does, where there's a question mark, on whether you can do it using other sources currently. So these are the sorts of things with the Health Survey for England, the Scottish Health Survey, and others that we have a look at. What proportion of the adult population is obese? Very basic prevalence question. Measurement of disease prevalence in the population, because inevitably we're interested in both diagnosed and undiagnosed. Is the increase in the prevalence of diabetes a real change, or are we just diagnosing more? What proportion of the population suffers from depression? You can actually read the list for yourself. Some of these are more challenging than others, and the list goes on. This did not take long for Anne to do. She sort of quickly scribbled it down in relatively minutes. How does loneliness impact on health? Even the international comparisons across completely different healthcare systems and so on. These are the sorts of data that we are currently collecting through our survey sources. And you'll notice with all these questions, or most of them at any rate, they are about the what or the how. They're not asking this question. And one of the things, it is lovely to be head of an organisation, the National Centre for Social Research, that is really interested in this question. Why? And of course it links to impact and what the policymakers actually want to find out. And surveys tend to be good around the why. It's interesting when you look through them, though, that not as many questions ask about the why in our national service than you might think, actually. But you can use examples. And of course, surveys don't have a monopoly on the why. You can get at why through big data sources, through qualitative research, and so on. But at the moment, we do use it, and they are good vehicles. So let me give an example. National Travel Survey, a very simple one that you could do in various ways, I suspect, in the future. Not just through surveys, or certainly not through diaries. Why, Guy, have you made that journey from A to B? National Travel Survey does that. And I might be going on the school run, I might be going shopping, or whatever. Now you could see there are lots of ways you could collect those data in the future, including on surveys, actually, by me wearing something or whatever. It's quite a simple example. Take another example, though, that's more complicated. Now, I've got a confession. Mr. Goodwin is overweight. Now, I don't mind acknowledging it. Tom's probably got it in ONS somewhere that an encrypted version of me is overweight. But why? I'm a perfectly sensible person. I know the risk factors linked to overweight. And there are two reasons why I always think, but you can get at them in different ways. One is a very obvious one, that I'm actually a bit lazy. My work-life balance as a CEO is not fantastic, and I eat crap food, frankly, and it's not great. There's a second reason, though, and you can get at this through a survey very straightforwardly by saying, what did you eat for breakfast this morning, Guy? And I had orange juice and cereal. There's a bit of a Hawthorne effect here because I knew I was talking tonight. And, so great so far. But anything else, Guy? Now this catches me out, because I had a cold Yorkshire pudding and I had half of a cheesecake from Morrison's, that toffee cheesecake with whirly cream things on. Now I can't admit I've just said that I ate that this morning. Now, there is background to this and explains the why, which is, as a child, Leslie, my sister, and I went to my grandparents who were used to rationing in the war, and they were not particularly wealthy, and they used to say, waste not, want not, Guy, and, you know, do you know how much of the world, the people in the world are actually hungry, and you should really not leave food. So Mr. Goodwin in the morning, you know, given I live on my own, you know, there's that cold Yorkshire pudding, and I'm trying. My daughter just chucks it in the bin, you know, but I am trying to do it, you know. But actually, at the same time, I have still got that view, waste not, want not. So there is a why, and there are ways you can implement policies that might well stop me doing that in the morning, like sort of not having these 4 Yorkshire pudding packs. You know, 2 would be nice. Because actually I don't have much time to do cooking. So anyway, why is important, and surveys are very good at why. Now, I did want to lob up a couple of other things. One was complexity and standardization. And just to note that our lives are not getting any simpler, are they? I think it's fair to say. Life, you know, becomes more complex. And it isn't just ethnicity, gender, age, the normal variables, is it? I mean, look at our family formations and relationships. All of that, Guy, are you living together and still together? Or are you living together but are really apart? Or are you living apart but you really are still an item together? Or are you living apart? And that's a sort of, you know, condensed version of it all, isn't it? And things are not getting simpler. And the survey is really rather good because of its ability, the wonderful advantage it has of allowing you to be in control of what you collect and be able to tailor the design. It's rather good with that complexity. And it's also good at looking across a wide range of different variables. I mean, the mental health example I gave earlier was a good one. It also, of course, should allow in the future the linkage with other sources that will considerably add value again. But complexity, life is not getting more standardized. The technology, we might want to standardize things, but we are getting more complicated as people. Now, I hate it when there are so many methodologists in the room, because there are a lot more advantages and disadvantages. But I think it is worth saying that there are real advantages in using surveys still. And we shouldn't underestimate these. They haven't really changed. And the advantages and disadvantages of surveys and administrative sources are still largely what they were many years ago. Actually, technology moves forward. But surveys are simple. You have control over the design. You can handle complexity. You can ensure consistency over time. You can do sampling to ensure that you get a representative sample, and so on. I mean, these you will all know well enough. There are disadvantages. Clearly, there are issues around getting small area and subgroup estimates. There are issues of cost and timeliness, response and non-response bias, and hard-to-reach groups. We could have a discussion on each of those for an hour, I suspect, in their own right. But I'm struck by when you look at each of those individual ones, the research doesn't necessarily support my preconceived ideas, like really high response rates are absolutely essential to handle non-response bias. But that's for another day. I ought to say something about big data and administrative data. Now, we've still got a long way to go with alternative data sources. There's fantastic opportunity, but there are issues around provenance, governance, frameworks, quality, methods, people, skills, data ethics, privacy, and so If you say it fast enough, it doesn't sound quite so bad. But we do have a long way to go before we get to our new world. It doesn't mean we shouldn't progress it, of course, because it's fantastic and it is well worth doing so. But let's not be under any illusion. Were our administrative data research centres really that successful? Not really. Can we hear the screams of delight from labour market statisticians at the ONS about the new simple universal credit data that's going to make everybody's life so much easier? Decades on from when I wrote Helpwrite with the Treasury, the white paper building trust in statistics, how many of us have even got access to the microdata of some of those sources still? Now, I know we're getting there with the DEA, but we are still not yet where we want to be, even at that level. And there's a wonderful paper actually by Professor David Hands, who's in the audience today, which sets out 15 of the challenges with using administrative data. I don't think those challenges are that new actually, but I recommend David's paper to you. If you're an optimist like me, sort of pour yourself a stiff brandy so you can start drinking it after challenge number 11, because as you work through it, you realize quite how many challenges there are in using administrative data. And it's something I learnt when I was at ONS, looking after crime statistics, that you had the police recorded crime and you had the crime survey for England and Wales. And the police recorded crime, my goodness, you can spend time running around in circles. And it isn't just a question of putting yourself on the board that decides the changes on police recorded crime. It is when one of the local police forces puts out a guidance note and you get a discontinuity. You know, it's that level. Now, I'm sorry the pun, but how do you police that? I mean, there are really, really big issues in using some of these data. Now, they're not insurmountable problems, so I wouldn't want to depress you too much, but this is not for today or tomorrow. We've still got quite a long way to go. So, I better speed up or not I will be in trouble. I was going to touch base on at least one of the issues that I raised earlier about the disadvantages of survey data. And I was going to concentrate on time, but I won't say much about it. But I think we are obsessed at the moment that sort of society and people are a bit like share prices and change in real time. And actually, all you really need to do and monitor is in real time. Why you need real-time data is when you need to monitor something in real time. You don't need it for the vast amount of things. You'll be amazed how few of us have actually changed our minds or behaviours since we've been in here for the last 20 minutes, you know. The only thing that's really changed in all of us is that we've aged by 20 minutes. I mean, there's very little that's changed in society. I mean, I found out this with population estimates, where you went round and you said, how frequently do you want population estimates? And people said, oh, in real time. And you said, what on earth for? You'd have to change your model every second. You know, and there's this sort of obsession that 6 months won't do. And actually, survey data today, you should be able to get them out a lot quicker than we do. I mean, the technology is there to enable it. I better move on to my conclusions. Let's make no mistake, there's a wonderful opportunity here. There are amazing things we can do, and there's some really good examples of us now using large volumes of data to help improve people's lives in different ways, and I think that's fantastic. It's an incredible opportunity. I would like, now I've got the pulpit, just to pay tribute to the many people in our community that are working with surveys and longitudinal studies for the incredible insights they give into life in the UK. I don't think we should underestimate that either. You see, I don't think it's a question of either or. Survey and longitudinal studies, I think inevitably are going to remain a key part of our infrastructure for some time to come. And I don't think we should be worried about that. We should welcome it, embrace it. If in due course technology allows us to do everything surveys are doing, it's fine. But let's not hide that this is today or even tomorrow. And note that we can do with surveys what many administrative data do in relation to population characteristics. We can collect those data too. But the reverse is not true, that administrative data can do everything the survey can do. And I think we need to be prepared that therefore the primacy between the social and the link between the social survey researcher and the policymaker will probably remain pretty strong for several years yet. And coming back to the final, this sort of stat stream, which I'm fully signed up to, is there a downside in it? And I just think we need to be very careful that as we move to having too much data, a sort of data saturation, that we don't devalue quality, that we don't accept things because they're just about okay. And you can see, I don't know, administrative data on ethnicity and whatever might fall into that at the moment. And I worry where the customer actually, the policy customer retains being king or queen in all of this as they are in the survey model currently. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, will we reach a stage where we just produce masses of data and I as a customer have to go on some database somewhere or other and self-service, a bit like I have to do with my bank, to see whether you've collected the thing that I really want, and finding that you haven't, but you sort of collected something which might be used instead. The brave new world, whether it actually delivers fully what we really want, will potentially depend on investment and cost. And my observation is that there is much work for us to do before that day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guy. As I say, we'll hold up any questions until after Tom's spoken, and then we'll take the questions at the end.
Hi, can you hear me at the back okay? Hi. Thanks very much, Guy. And I think there's a great challenge there around can administrative data and big data really deliver on, I think, the promise and so on. So, I mean, my starting point is slightly different, but I suspect we're going to come to quite a lot of common ground. And I start from the position where data gives us a window onto the issues that we're interested in. So all data sources are biased, and surveys are biased. They're not ground truth. They're telling us something about an issue or a relationship or a pattern that we're interested in. Similarly, big data, administrative data tell us something about that underlying relationship or issue that we're interested in. And I'm going to start from a couple of headlines, quite literally. So if we're interested in the relationship between what we eat and our weight, obesity, and this kind of neatly ties into one of Guy's examples. One of the ways to look at that is to weigh people, and another way is to try and track what people are eating, and as Guy expertly sort of set out, that's really difficult. If we take food diaries and ask people to fill these in and say, what are you eating over a period of weeks and so on, what's going on, and that's a hard problem. That then doesn't correlate with the weight of the nation. So we see people on food diaries eating less over time, but we see the weight of the nation going up. So there's a discrepancy there. So you might want to dig into that. So actually you might want another source of information to triangulate against. And in this example, what was done was using a doubly labeled water, which is a biometric. So essentially you ask people to take something which you can then measure over time, which looks at energy use, and you can compare that to what they've put in their food diaries, their survey, if you like. And what you get is a big discrepancy. You get a mismatch between the survey response, my memory and recollection of what I've been eating, versus this biometric. Now you can say, of course, we can bring that data into the survey, and of course we can and we should, and that's great. But the point is, additional sources give you greater power. The second kind of point is that in pretty much any field you're interested in, there are very high-profile mistakes or errors that come up from polling, from estimates of what's going on and what happens. And so just in my working lifetime, we've had 2 fairly catastrophic failures by opinion polling industries over quite a simple question. What are you going to vote tomorrow? You know, that's not a difficult one. I don't have to kind of cast back in my memory for that. I'm just kind of looking at opinions. So one of the strengths of surveys and asking questions of your users or your community or your group is opinion and belief and what's coming next, what I'm going to do. That's really hard to measure in other ways, but we get it wrong. If we use survey data, we regularly get it wrong. And you can say, you know, there's always a post hoc explanation. Many of you will remember shy Tories from the 1992 election. You'll remember the 2015 election, you know, the post-polling or post-mortems. But we see these examples quite regularly. A fairly recent paper that looks at combining, again, several major surveys in the US with welfare recipients and tax dollars, if you like, or welfare dollars, and food stamp payments, show that you've got a big discrepancy again. And what this points to me is that we have a problem where we're relying on survey data to tell us about the world as the only source. So you have to bring together other sources of data. And I think as a result, you see things like this. So over the period from 1980 to 2010, in the top 4 economic journals, or general interest journals, the proportion of papers that relied on survey data as their primary source dropped from 60% in 1980 to 20% in 2010. Now, there'll be all sorts of factors underlying that. It's not a simple story, obviously. But the point is that as a raw material, researchers are starting to move away from from survey data for all sorts of reasons. And that leads me to my slightly provocative first point of the day, which is I believe that surveys should be the last resort. Don't start with an idea of what issue or what are we trying to understand, what data do we need to collect. Start with that as your last resort, because to put it in a more positive frame, I absolutely go with Guy's description. Surveys are like Heineken. They fill the gaps. They reach the parts that other data sets don't already reach. And Guy gave some really nice examples. So things like data that you don't necessarily collect and publish into your admin data sets. So things like ethnicity, religion. Maybe. They may be in some sources, but not always. Complexity. Again, that's quite hard to pick up from most administrative data or big data sources. Multivariate analysis, again. But we're kind of getting there. But there are gaps that survey data can fill. But I don't believe that it should be the first port of call. They should be the last resort. So what comes first? I mean, I guess in the job title, you're probably going to expect me to say satellite data or kind of mobile phones or something like that. But I want to kind of step back a bit. And I think this is probably where we start coming to the common ground. So this, for some of you may recognize, is the Phaistos disk, which was discovered in 1908 by an Italian archaeologist in Crete. It's linear B, which is the earliest European writing we've been able to decipher. And it was deciphered in the 50s, and there's quite a nice story about that. If you like that sort of thing, go and look it up. What it is, it's records of what's being held in palace storerooms and storehouses. So the earliest known writing in Europe that we can decipher is administrative data. It's telling you about stuff. It's telling you it's a record of what's being held. And it doesn't look that different from administrative data in 2018. This is what we're trying to do at ONS, and I absolutely will pick up in the questions about the challenges, but I want to give some of the kind of successes as well. So the link to administrative data sources that we're interested in at ONS range right through from, in this sense, from business data held from organizations like HMRC, which tell you about business tax, so VAT records and so on, through to salaries, wages, employment data, so real-time information on PAYE, linked through to a number of things. So you obviously have employee data, you have businesses, you have, from employees and businesses, you have addresses, household data, and so on. All of these links and linking that administrative data is what gives you the spine, which you can then start sitting the data which reaches the parts that other data doesn't reach, so surveys and so on. So that linked administrative data for me, and the kind of thrust of developing ONS data source and underpinning spines is very much the first prize. And survey data kind of sits in alongside that and helps fill some of the gaps. So that's the sort of second big point. And I think that is really kind of where the thrust of developing data as an infrastructure that all people can use, whether academic research groups, government statisticians and policymakers and so on, or even organisations outside public sector systems. That's the first prize which really should be kind of pushing hard for. So if we just kind of look back at the economics papers on using survey data, what was it in its place? And there's a really clear trend. The same journals, the papers that we're using as their primary sources increased from 20 to 60% in relying on administrative data. And that's something about the rise for me of admin data. There is more data availability, there's the technical infrastructure to make use of it, the skills and the processing power to make use of it, and get faster analysis out of what was really beforehand a very, very difficult problem to basically take analysis on a whole population, on a whole data source, and make sense of it. So I'm just going to kind of flick back some history. I mean, you know, why now, and what's different, and what kind of gives me cause for optimism? I mean, we've always had models. So for those of you who recognise this, it's the MONIAC, Monetary National Income Analog Computer. This is from 1949. It's a model of the economy, a lovely thing. We've always had data. So those of you might have seen this in a presentation before. This is London Underground workers sorting 4 million tube tickets in 1939 to assess what are the most popular tube routes. Now, you know, when someone comes up and says, data's really hard to work with, you just show them this picture, because big data or different source of data have always been with us. You know, and I've always wondered, how did they process the census in 1841, 1851? You know, and I have certainly recollections of talking to people who used to do the unemployment counts and literally put cards and grids on the floor, broken down by age and gender. So those sort of data sources have always been there. We've always had sort of computing in some form or other. So computer obviously originally meant a person. This is the computer department, indeed, the computing section in the 1920s, using obviously a fairly different set of machines. But again, we've always had that concept. This kind of gives you the clue. $3,400 for your 10 meg drive. You know, there's some of us in the room that probably remember those sorts of costs. So bringing those all together, the ability to use a different scale of data is very much with us. And that's not something that's down the line. That kind of technology, technical infrastructure, and the tools is very much here today. And we're seeing that in all sorts of domains. So people always say, oh, AI is a hype cycle. Well, you know, what's going to come through? That's just, you know, is it something you really need to be aware of? You're using machine learning and AI on your phones when you talk to Siri or when you use Google. So all of those things are based on huge amounts of data. And we as a community should really be looking to use the same level of technical infrastructure, of data availability, to tell us about the world, which are the problems that we're trying to solve. So understand about the economy, about society, and so on. So that was lots of background. And I wasn't sure how much detail I wanted to get into or people would want to get into. But let's just kind of give a couple of early examples. So we mentioned data from HMRC. So the tax system collects data from businesses, which is self-reported. So at some level you could say it's some form of surveying. But it's regular and it covers the entire business population. Under the Digital Economy Act, which I see as an absolute game changer for statistics and official statistics, HMRC are able to share this with ONS. Now, technically, there are real challenges there, you know, understandably. happily go into those in some of the questions. But what does this give us? So there's a big program of improving or strengthening GDP measures. And the VAT data that came in from HMRC, that's provided from HMRC at company level, is one of the key components that enabled ONS to move from a quarterly to a monthly GDP output. Now, I think that's the first in the world of National Statistics Officers have managed that. That's a huge step forward. And you think, well, you know, slightly faster data, yeah, whatever. And Guy sort of made that point quite forcefully. You sort of think, well, nothing much is going to change. But actually, in 1 to 3 months, a lot changes. So this is the recession downturn in 2008. It took us about 5 years for the size of the economy to recover or return to its previous size. The estimated value for being aware and being sure that something was happening faster for earlier identification of that downturn was around £12 billion, which worked out about £1 billion per week. And you can say, well, what can you do with that? It all depends on what levers you've got to influence, which really comes down to all data and all statistics is about improving decisions. And some of the survey analysis, the research, is a longer term improving decisions and understanding, but some of it's very short term. So the Bank of England has levers to change interest rates very rapidly to increase the supply of credit to businesses. So that kind of impact is quite significant. So there's a direct correlation here between faster data, which linked administrative data at granular level provides, and big impact in the real world. Another example, and this kind of comes back to one of the areas, so the data science campus that I lead was launched about 1.5 years ago, and one of the kind of drivers was to try and produce more headlines like this. So this was work done over a number of years by one of the NHS groups, really taking a lot more time and attention to some of the data within the system. So some of this kind of a sum of a lot of different pieces of work, but one of those pieces was looking at prescription data. So individual prescriptions and then run up through GPs. And look at things like how many of those prescriptions were generics and how many of them were branded. And could you have used generics instead of branded? And added up over the entire NHS population, that's again a very big impact. So you do have, from careful analysis of the administrative data that you're providing, a lot of potential. So I'm going to go on, just say something about big data. And having only joined government kind of 18 months ago or whatever, I was quite surprised to see that in government, big data generally means data produced by someone else, because it's not often actually really big data. You're often thinking about something, well, it's, you know, it's messy, or we don't understand the processes that generated this data. There are a lot of challenges with it, but it's not necessarily big in the kind of real sense that computer scientists tend to do it, to talk about it. But the point is there's lots of it out there, and you can do some very interesting things. And this kind of maybe comes back to this Heineken point, that you're always looking to improve your understanding of the world and the issues that you're interested in. So let's take an example from some of the work that the campus has been looking at. Natural capital team in ONS is interested in the value of the environment for various reasons. If you can value that, put it on the balance sheet, that gives you a way then of supporting and enabling different developments and of costing the kind of the impact of certain programs and so on. So there's complicated economic side analysis into that. Very interesting stuff. But you'll have big gaps in that data set. So you don't have any real local environmental data or natural capital data. So one of the starting points that we looked at was, can you produce a data set that tells you about local vegetation, trees and shrubs, hedges, that kind of stuff? Because that is very highly important in terms of air pollution removal. In London, that's a big issue, one of the biggest health issues, and we talk about obesity on the other side. And you can put in some kind of estimates of costing there. But again, no data. So where do you do? What do you do? You could go out and survey. You could crowdsource. Or you could start looking at things like image data. And you have quite a few image data sources that tell you about local areas. Satellite imagery is one of them, and there's some very nice work starting to come on stream now using satellite imagery at quite high resolution to tell you about a local area. In this case, we used Google Street View, and we were basically asked the question of images. What's in the image? How much of that is vegetation? And you can do that in a number of ways. So we started off just doing green in the scene, very simple. You can then go through and start using deep learning, convolutional neural networks. I'll quite happily go into details if anyone cares. But you can sample here 10-meter intervals around the country, 20-meter intervals, whatever you want, and produce an estimate that gives you a vegetation index for the entire country at local level. And again, that's something different that surveys, that other sources really struggle to reach, which I think is a very interesting example of using big data in this sense. And we've published this out, and you can now go and look at it for our first 2 cities, which are for local reasons, Cardiff and Newport, because that's where the team's based. But other cities will soon be available, as well as Heineken. A final kind of example just on sort of big data or data held by others. So coming back to this GDP example, if you're interested in GDP measures or early indicators, there's a ton of stuff out there. And again, you could go and survey and look at a number of different ways of picking up the issues, but you've got all sorts of sources that can kind of give you an insight into what's happening, what's changing. So one of those is movement of goods, a significant part of the economy. Trade in goods tends to come through shipping. In the UK, we're kind of lucky by that. So you can look at what ships are doing. There's a GPS-powered data set which covers every ship in the world, updated every 3 or 4 seconds. That's quite big data. I think it was the largest data set we brought into ONS when we brought in just the UK version. It's quite messy as well, all sorts of things. You can look at road traffic. So folks in the Netherlands are looking at traffic volumes and traffic flow as a leading indicator of what their GDP estimates might be when they come out. Again, these are all messy. They're not a direct measure of exactly what you're looking at, but they're a proxy or an indicator of. One of the projects we're really interested in is, can you use internet use, broadband traffic? Because services are responsible for about 80% of the UK economy. Much of those services don't involve movement of goods. They involve movement of stuff over the web or over the lines. This is an old one. I think this is World Cup, possibly 2006. The old kind of saw used to be at half-time in the football games was the peak energy use when everyone put their kettles on. You can see half-time in football games on the internet because people used to go and put their phones on and check what the email's doing. You look at 2018, and we looked the next day after the England games, at half-time the internet use drops because loads of people are streaming it on their phones. So you have a hugely complicated pattern which is built up of a whole number of other aspects, but you can pick out economic indicators in there. Data held by others is also critical. And a really obvious one is financial transactions. So something that we've been working on at ONS for some time is really building relationships or collaborations where we can help carry out analysis directly on financial transactions, again, with only aggregate analysis produced. But one of the relationships here, we have a secondment now of 2 of the economist team directly into Barclays to look at the merchant payment systems. So what this gives you is what's being spent in merchants, then linked to merchant classifications. So you can look at spend by sector at local level over time. You can look at nighttime economy, you can look at regional and local patterns, changes over time, that kind of thing, which again is very hard to kind of pick up at survey level or by going out and asking, because you have to ask a lot of people a lot of time. And I'm going to finish this section with just kind of flashing up really what I think of as kind of one of the really big challenges here. And this kind of relates back to Guy's point, is the world is changing very fast, but should you care? Does it matter? And this is an example that Jonathan Affel kind of showed up, which is, this is the prices for a standard commodity. It's a Monopoly board game, in case you can't read it. It's the price over, I think, 5 years, and it ranges from about £5 up to 19 quid. And it's going up and down all the time. Now, this is data scraped by a price comparison site, scraped from Amazon and another group. It's a published paper. What this says is, what do price indices really mean? What does inflation really mean when prices of standard commodities are changing like this? And also, this data is available. The way this data is used is you put a trigger on and say, when it drops below a certain amount, tell me, because I'll go and buy it. So the data itself is changing consumer behavior. So there's this feedback loop, which is very, very complicated. And this comes back to me and said, if you were trying to say, what are price indices doing? What is inflation doing? You have a whole series of sources. Asking or checking prices at one point in time is one way of approaching that, has a number of issues. Checking them in real time is another approach, has a number of issues. You want to be aware of all of these things, because it's very complicated, obviously. So that was the kind of final challenge really to put up. But I think price movement in the real world and some change does matter, and we do have data analysis to look at it. We need to build models that bring together both the survey side, the administrative side, and also other forms of data, big data, data held outside the system. So I'm kind of going to roll it up there, and I talked about a number of things, but surveys are the last resort. They're not ground truth, they're just one view onto the issues you're interested in. First prize for the infrastructure, the spine that you then link everything else onto, argue that administrative data provides that. Big data, or data held by organizations outside our kind of traditional ken, I think just getting started. You know, we're seeing more come online. Companies are clearly very aware of the value of that data, so there's a very large and interesting conversation to have there between government and companies over data ownership, ethics, and the public obviously have to be right in there at the start of that conversation. So those four kind of bring it together, and I'm going to illustrate the final thing. So a number of countries don't run censuses anymore because they have linked registers, linked administrative data. One of those is Netherlands, Denmark is another. They're quite well known. So in Denmark and Holland, or Netherlands, they haven't run a census since the 1970s. Well, the census for the UK costs 450 million pounds over the decade. It's a huge investment. The return on that investment is significant, perhaps 10 to 1, it depends how you measure it, but a really big investment. So it is a really worthwhile exercise. Probably everyone in the room uses census, in a great detail. But if you can replace that with a linked administrative system and use that to fill most of the gaps, you have a great starting point. But what happens is there are still gaps. And how Netherlands and Denmark and others fill that is with very carefully targeted surveys. Just like here, the UK has some of the most advanced, but some of the most skilled, some of the best methodology and expertise around censuses. That's well recognized. You know, the community here is a hugely skilled community. Targeting those surveys into the gaps, that has to be where it is. That has to be the future of surveys. Thanks very much.
Okay, we can open it up for questions and comments. We've got well, we had a couple of roving mics. And yeah, that's all right. No, it's okay. So, who wants to be first? And when you give your contribution, can you say who you are, please? Yes. Okay. Thank you. One down here. Just. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Daniela Luca from Sage, and I have a comment, and maybe other people can comment on that as well. But when anyone speaks with me or to me and disbelieves the future of surveys, I tell them, look at SurveyMonkey that went floating in September, and Qualtrics that was just acquired for 8 billion. So that must be an indication that that's not going to go away.
your comment about...
Sorry, could you say who you are?
Oh, sorry. I'm Emma from the Department for Work and Pensions. The comment that you made about people, how much they eat and how much they think they eat, do you think that actually that could become a new branch for surveys, that actually the social side of what we think we do and what we actually do?
So I'm first gone.
Yeah, shall I take it? I mean, at the moment, we collect information on obesity and we collect information on calories, and they don't tie up. Now that's recognised, it's been like that for many years, it's reported on. There are many things you could look to do. I think it's recognised, for example, looking at weighting and those sort of things to try to tie up that difference, or using, I think it's the DLW method. I'm not an expert in that method, others in the audience are, but you know, that can be used to double check and is collected on surveys as well, actually. So there are different methods you can use, I think.
Absolutely, yes. I would see those as two parts that you would bring together. And I think there are lots of examples of where essentially you can use separate sources to improve, to add strength to each other. So, for example, looking at, we have small area measured data for this region, but not for these regions, but we have enough features that we can use to produce a small area estimate. This is the sort of thing that's been used for estimating population in Afghanistan, where it's been very difficult to run a census in the recent years. So there's a census for 1979, and then you have things like satellite imagery, which can give you features that you can use to model, and you bring them together in exactly the same way that you would use some of the individual level W-label water method, biometric methods to add into the census. So I think that kind of combination of sources is powerful.
Okay, there's one over here. Oh, well, should we take this one here and then that one up there? So this lady here first.
Thank you. Alison Park from UCL. Thank you, both of you. I agreed totally with both of what you said. I mean, it strikes me that whichever route one goes down, whether you're increasingly moving towards linking survey data to other forms of data, or whether you're just reliant on big data itself, there's a huge need for training in terms of the sorts of people who are going to be making use of that data. And there are also very different implications in terms of how you access and store it. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about, I suppose particularly thinking of universities and how they can develop, how they can best develop people who are actually going to be able to go out there in the world and use this new great world of data.
Well, look, there's quite a classic description of a data scientist. First as a unicorn, but then secondly as a combination of domain expert, statistician, and computer scientist. It kind of brings together that ability to use data with perhaps great volume, different sort, structure and so on, so perhaps text data might be one of those. But without, and the domain expertise kind of helps you understand and identify what questions you're going to look at. So far, so obvious. But far too much work doesn't bring in the statistician. And there's a nice Venn diagram that basically, the bit without the statistician is the danger zone, because that's where you produce simplistic models or results that actually bear no relation to the real world and are statistically non-robust and all the rest of it. You have to be bringing in that aspect of skill set as well. So I think there's a kind of a two-way thing here, where if you're looking at using data without the expertise, the methodological rigor of the statisticians community, then you can miss out, you really fail to kind of hit what you're trying to do. The other aspect is data science, or the ability to use these sorts of data, they're just tool sets. Statisticians have always been ahead of the curve in terms of using different forms of data. So I think it's the student's t-test is an outcome of industrial processes and applying problems that people are looking at in the real world, just as we have now techniques and methods and infrastructure that come out of problems that people like Google and Amazon have tried to have coped with or struggling with. So it's the same technical kind of problems that people are solving, but many years later. So I think that kind of was a sort of high-level point saying, yes, you need those skills. you can't start from data science without bringing stats into it, very at the initial stage, and you can't, I believe, do statistics without understanding some of the processes, techniques and tools that are now available. And luckily, people come out of university with R and Python, they're kind of understanding that actually there are packages, there are things I can use from day one that mean I'm much more familiar with using this kind of data and these sorts of processes.
And I don't want to add a lot, but I think you're right, Alice. I mean, there's got to be a major sort of training program, and I don't necessarily think it's actually whatever source or sources you're used to. I just think we've got to be a lot more tech savvy. As statisticians, I think that's inevitable. I mean, one thing I would say, though, is that in my mind, it isn't just the technology that has caused us not to be able to use administrative data effectively. I mean, we have had technology that can analyze administrative data for many years, actually. I mean, it's obviously more powerful now, the administrative sources are improving and so on, but a lot of the problems actually with administrative data actually are political, are sort of quality and scope related, and aren't actually to do with the technology necessarily.
Carl, I think first, and then...
First of all, thank you both, and I have to agree with virtually everything both of you have said. One thing I do want to pick up on, though, here is taking this forward. Tom, you mentioned all sources are biased. I couldn't agree more. Guy, you specifically talked about issues with administrative data, and having worked with admin data quite a bit myself in the past, I've become a cropper a few times from quality issues arising there. And that's what I want to put forward here. As you said, Guy, we're going to be working in a bigger space where we've got far more data of mixed source, mixed quality, issues of representation, issues of measurement. I also, my personal tendency is to agree with you that I'm a bit worried that we will see more and more of these are the results, this is the data, let's forget about quality. How do we start promoting the quality issues and get that across to all those users and customers who are going to be funding this and consuming the statistics that we're using in the future in this new brave new mixed world of data? Thanks.
Should I have the first go? I mean, I think it's going to be a real challenge, and I think it is a real challenge now. And I think increasingly we are going to have to be, you know, it isn't just the data themselves, it is the organisations that, you know, the badging of trusted organisations. I mean, ONS is a good example of this. I remember many years ago when I worked at the CSO, and all the arguments over the years about whether to change the badging of ONS and so on, and the importance actually over a very sustained period of the sorts of efforts that have gone in to build relationships, say with the media at ONS, so that they are actually a trusted organisation, so that there is more trust in the economic data, for example, that's going out, and people are quoted on the news and everything else as if they are telling the truth. And that takes a lot of investment. And if you don't do it, you know, I fear what will happen is that, you know, and this is the danger of having some sort of big database and pulling it all together. You know, you could imagine, I mean, if we took DWP ethnicity data, for example, I mean, I think we know that it's not absolutely, you know, the quality is not fantastic. And the danger is you think, yeah, but that is better than spending a lot of money actually collecting ethnicity data on a survey. And so you bung all this together and it just becomes a rather sort of shambolic, lower quality type thing. So that is the danger. But I think trusted organisations as well as trusted data is really important. And it's something that at NatSem we're trying to build, but it's, in some ways it's more difficult for us than Stats Office. But it's hard work, Carl. I don't have a wonderful sort of answer.
I think that trusted point is critical, and that kind of, for me, leads to open sourcing. So I'm kind of very interested in the model that CERN used in terms of developing a methods library to do some very, very complex modelling, data capture, acquisition and use, which really worked across the physics community and developed a set of what are now open source models and open source methods and open source code. And I think we have the same challenge for administrative data and then for big data as well. So the methods library that ONS and others develop for use on admin data, I think will be absolutely critical, and it's critical that that's open sourced, available to all, testable and challengeable by all. So what are the assumptions that you've made in processing this? What does quality mean for something that's already a population-based data source? Those sorts of things. That's a very interesting conversation, and it's one we're really just getting started on, but I think that's where it is, and that's sort of the development in this field.
I think there's one on the end there. We could go up top there and then here. Yeah.
Paul Kiff from the Research Advice Service. Two things worry me. One is that I have a lot of experience of trying to use so-called administrative data, namely SAT scores and comparing scores. There are at least 100 ways of fiddling SAT scores for individual scores, and anyone who tries to make meaningful comparisons will come a cropper. Secondly, it seems to be the big problem with surveys is the declining response rates. And we seem to be engaged in a permanent quest to increase the methods, or the accuracy of our methods of collection, when I think there's more investment justified in working out how to correct for the bias induced by non-response.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that. I mean, maybe as a sort of straight example, census doesn't include questions on income, so which is clearly a huge gap in a survey of the UK at local level. There are all sorts of reasons why that's not the case, and people here will be intimately familiar with those. But what you end up with is a gap. So you can then try and fill that by other surveys and other pieces, or you can say, well, actually, we know quite a lot about wages, salaries, direct through from taxation methods. And so that's the sort of approach that the Administrative Data Census Programme is looking at. So essentially, it's a two-track. Census 21 will publish and produce high-quality outputs, as has been done before. But the admin data census will say, well, which of those could we replace? And I think Guy's box of, which could you completely replace, what more could you add, and what more you could add is income is one of those big areas. Now, there'll be gaps that you can't fill, of course, and there will be things in administrative data that you can fiddle, or can be changed, or can be very subjective based on the definitions. And again, you kind of got complexity there. But I think the point is, for me, that the survey data sets, when we do have a way of comparing with other robust data, so some of the headlines I showed, you see errors, measurement error within the survey. So you're right, there's declining response rates, but that's both on the units, the surveys themselves, there's declining response rates on the items, and then there's declining quality on the items. So we've got this sort of triple problem. And admin data gives you a way of filling some of those gaps. So I don't believe surveys should be asking questions which we already know answers to.
I think, I was brought up really believing that response rates, high response rates, were absolutely essential. And there was a time I remember, which rather ages me, of the labour force survey being above 80% rather than response rates, rather than wherever they are now, below 50%. And so instinctively, I feel declines in response rates are dreadful things. However, some of the research that is conducted does challenge me on it, and I find quite challenging. And it is around this issue of non-response bias, which really is the key thing that we are trying to control. And in effect, an organisation like ours can chase response really, really hard when you're at the sort of 60% levels or 50% levels, reissuing work at quite significant costs, looking to raise response rates by 1 or 2 percentage points, and actually some of the evidence shows that effort can be wasted effort in terms of improving your results. And I think some of the work that is now being done on panels really does challenge this even further, because response rates on some of these random probability panels, including the NatSam panel, but the Dutch model and other models, I understand are really, really quite low after you take account of all the various attritions and everything else, and yet considerable effort is made to make those samples representative. And the results, when you actually look at them, I mean, they're not as good as face-to-face surveys, but they are not catastrophic either. And these response rates can be really very, very low. So, and I think that is a real challenge to, my traditional way of thinking. And so one, I think, moving forward, of the things that we really do have to do is start focusing back onto non-response bias.
Thanks. I think there's a question down here.
Sorry, my voice is very poor at the moment. I'm Barbara Noble. I'm a trustee at NatSen. I was particularly interested in what Guy was saying about pre- and post-population of survey data, because it seems to me that if you go along to a household with a lot of data about the household already and ask them to fill in the gaps, you won't be very popular, and immediately there'll be a great issue of trust. But there are a lot of surveys, a lot of data sources that you can ask people if they are willing to do that. The one I know most about is on the National Travel Survey. People are asked if we can use their vehicle details to look up details of the vehicle at DVNA, so they won't have to go through long, complicated things. And you can imagine other possibilities too. Perhaps have their national insurance number to link with other things. There might be lots of different places where you could ask people if they were willing to use admin sources to save them time, because it's always worth giving people the opportunity to benefit themselves. So I suspect it should really be post rather than pre-population of survey data.
Okay. Any other questions? One over there, is it? Sorry.
Yeah, it's Nick Allen from University of Essex. Thanks for the talks. No one's yet reacted to your provocative statement about surveys being the last resort, so I thought I'd sort of try to respond to that. And I wonder whether, when you say the last resort, how long would you need to wait until you decide that it's the last moment? How much effort would you need to expend, in that process before spending the money on the survey, or deciding that you don't need to? It's kind of given the some of the problems, but the strengths of administrative data, not least that it's not become as available as we'd want it to be, with the speed that we'd like it to be. There seem to be problems with that. I wonder if you could describe a practical example of what you're talking about here, whether it's imaginary or, it's happened.
Very good points, and well raised. Maybe an example then from census. So this kind of comes back to what point do you ask people? So in the 2011 census, about 500,000 people got who owns your house wrong. So people living in social housing, about 500,000 said, I live in a council house. But actually it's no longer owned by the council, it's been transferred on to registered social landlords. And that kind of shift is a big shift in terms of housing ownership. And if you were going to start, so the question here would be, who owns the house that this person lives in? We know that. The land registry and the records from social housing and so on kind of give you a very clear starting point. How can you get access to the individual data? You said it's a hypothetical example. So there are challenges with that, of course. But if you're starting from the point of who owns these houses, I wouldn't necessarily start from a survey for that. And similarly, what's the income in the local area? Again, I would start thinking about, well, what can we get in terms of administrative data from PAYE and so on. So there are kind of a number of things where I would start very strongly from a position of using the data. If there was something about how green is the local area, again, I would probably start thinking about what's the local area look like, which might lead me onto satellite imagery or kind of direct images. So those are sort of factual things. There's probably then something which is much fuzzier, which is certainly around kind of belief and opinions and so on, and I would certainly start from surveys for those. So I suspect there's a way of categorizing questions that you're interested in, and people here will probably know a nice way of doing that, where you can either think about data that is organic and already out there and generated and you can use, versus data that you want to define and ask, and that kind of distinction might be a useful one to start from. But yeah, I'd like your as an admission, we were tasked with how many data scientists are there in government? What's the skill set? So of course, surveys are a last resort, yeah? So we sat down and thought, well, there's all sorts of things we could do. We could look at civil service job ads. We could look at skills in terms of their applications and so on, CVs. We could look at job titles. We could look at, how many meetups there are, lots of things you could do. And then we kind of said, you know what, survey is a really good way of looking at this because we need to do it in this time, and actually the other data sources are hard to get. So absolute admission, we would use surveys are the last resort, but that often comes up quite quickly if you've got a deadline.
I think it's the survey of the last resort thing is too optimistic at this point in time. It's too broad, and you'll notice that we're talking about slightly different things, because it's not it's not either or in my view. I mean, Tom is basically talking about basic facts, and it isn't just about attitudes on the social survey side, I'm afraid. It is about, if we want to find out about home factors and their impact on school outcomes or the home learning environment or whatever it is on the education side, it's, it's a different ballgame than just basic facts. You're actually looking at inquiry, social inquiry and investigation. So I think it's wrong just to quote opinion polls and attitudes, actually. There's something much more fundamental and sophisticated in this. And I think actually when ONS had a sources directorate a few years back, and we tried to actually look at bringing business surveys and social surveys together, it really exposed, I mean, some people in the room will remember it, exposed the truth that actually you are talking about quite different things. One is rather simple, factual, somewhat burdensome, that you don't mind pre-populating. The other actually is trying to get at often the complexity of human life, and I'm afraid it isn't something that is just quite trivial, that you can sort of up front say, well, let's see, let's try to do all this complexity from administrative data, and we may or may not need surveys afterwards. I think it's more complicated than that on the social side.
Okay, thanks. Yes?
I was wondering what you thought the impact of education and data skills in schools would have on surveys in the future. Do you think if school education increased in data skills, would people then know how to use admin data more and go away from using surveys in the future?
I'm sorry, it was a bit quiet down here. Could you speak a bit, I don't know if the microphone's on.
I don't know if it's on. Can you hear me?
Mm.
Okay, so I was wondering, if we were to increase data skills education for schools, would then school children in the future have more admin data skills? So then would that encourage people to move away from surveys in the future, do you think? Optimistic, yes.
Oh, of course.
It may well do for certain things. I mean, I still feel that with administrative data, you are typically getting, at the end, administrative data actually collects data from us or businesses or whatever. And those data will often be quite factual stuff, and they will often be, at least currently, in siloed streams. So, traditionally school, data, collected about pupils in one strand, and about health in another, about national insurance numbers and work in another, and linking all those things is a big challenge, but you are still getting at basic factual information. So great if we because Tom's right, I mean, we want to use more and more administrative data where we can, and we want to link survey data in and so on to it, but I don't think it's either or.
I think absolutely we agree on that either or thing. Maybe something about kind of what some of the facts bit, I think, are really important. So if you kind of look at medical statistics, so the links between, say, smoking and cancer, obviously picked up from longitudinal surveys, and a huge success, and one of the big kind of health successes and statistical survey successes. That's quite a strong relationship. You could pick that up with in a number of ways, but surveys can really pick that up. As you get to finer grained or rarer events and rare occurrences, then you need bigger populations to analyse and identify those facts. And so that's kind of, for me, there's a trade-off there where actually you do need administrative data if you're going to look at a population to identify rare events and the factors and things that perhaps influence that. So some of the skills around using administrative data or thinking about population level data sets, I think absolutely in terms of school level, from school onwards. But I think more broadly, statistical literacy and data literacy is just a huge challenge for all of us, and kind of ability to test and challenge facts that as they're stated, and percentages and numbers on buses and things like that are just really important skill set for the general population, of which I'm one.
Okay, I think we'll just take, take these two final questions, I think, then one at the back and one here. This one first, perhaps?
Hi, Raj Patel from Understanding Society. Thank you for both your presentations. I'm mindful that there was a leading AI expert who was giving some advice to school pupils about what careers they might do in the future. And her guidance was that, in fact, if you're a software engineer, you better get out of the field because AI is going to destroy a lot of those jobs. But instead, the recommendation she made was that really people needed to get into occupations that were more human. And that leads me to think that, in fact, isn't there a risk that as the volume of big data grows and admin data grows, in fact, the thing that will seem to be not particularly good at is understanding people, because in a way, those things don't tell you really about what it means to be human.
I very much agree. I think there's a really interesting example from chess. So you're probably I'm sure you're all aware that the world chess champion is currently a computer and has been since '97 when Kasparov lost to Big Blue or Deep Blue or whatever it was. But what's kind of less known is that actually humans plus computers still beat computers alone. So kind of that combination. So in AI, the kind of, often people talk about it as augmented intelligence now. Actually, that's using some of the analysis, some of the data tools, along with human decision making, it still beats a computer on its own. And that's in a pure logic domain, which should be totally solvable. So actually, if you roll that into domains like real world jobs, then of course, you need humans, and they're always going to be there.
And NatSen exists to make lives better, people's lives better through evidence, so you won't be surprised. No, I agree with you.
Okay, I think we had one final question here.
Yes, Simon Briscoe. I mean, my first question really is to ask if you could answer Barbara's question or her point. I've never really understood why the ONS or NatSen or anyone else, for example, doesn't put a national insurance number or a passport number or a car registration number, whatever it is, on every survey, because some people will fill it in and that will start to provide the links. And if that had started yonks ago, we would by now have this great data set. So I hope that doesn't count as my question. I just think that that's such a good point, it deserves a proper answer. My question really is, I'm a bit surprised that you haven't filtered out some things where the administrative data would obviously work. I mean, one that you mentioned, Tom, was inflation. I don't understand why the ONS scrapes prices off the web. That said, if you did get the point of sale data, you would absolutely have the consumer expenditure, the product size, the price, the time of day it was bought, and everything else. So I don't understand why there isn't more attention on particular things like that. And finally, maybe for Guy, I just, Do you worry about facts anymore? It's a word you've used quite a lot. You know, when it comes to gender or sexuality, we've become a lot more fluid about those things. But, you know, a few weeks ago, there's that story about the bloke that was going to start identifying as being 20 years younger than himself. You know, the thoughts cross my mind as the years creep by that that's quite a good idea. So, you know, if I answer the survey, would any of it be remotely truthful to you, even if I felt it was truthful to me?
Shall I start on 1 and 3 and you get the middle one? If I concentrate on Barbara's question first, I mean, I tend to agree you would post-populate. There were two elements to it, really. One is you would post-populate some of the stuff, certainly on a social survey you wouldn't sort of arrive with a whole load of administrative data on the people. I think it is the issue around the national insurance numbers and potentially asking those questions is things that I suspect have been looked at. I certainly think ONS have looked at it in the context of the census, asking those sort of questions. If you had an administrative census, you would suddenly be into issues around over-coverage rather than under-coverage. So when you use your coverage surveys, would you collect national insurance numbers and so on and use that in a census context? My recollection, and I may be wrong, but my recollection is the reason why there has been some work done, but people in the audience might know better than me, that actually suggested asking them on social surveys was a difficult thing to do in a response context. And I think some work was done in that, but it was quite a long time ago. And it may be we should be replicating it now, but I think that was the issue originally. It was about response rates on the surveys. Of course, the census, you know, potentially you've got the compulsory angle to it. If I take the last one, I mean, there will always be some level of response bias in surveys, and I think it's a fact of life. It's not just surveys, of course. It's big data, it's admin data and everything else as well. I mean, some admin data, of course, it won't. But I think, you know, and that risk may well be increasing. I'll just give an anecdote, it's just a story, and I know it's not a survey, but, you know, Facebook, what you put on Facebook and all these different sources can be, I was amazed, you know, talking to my family, and you know, occasionally as a CEO you get somebody sort of on Facebook threatening you, you know, that they're going to come round to your house and bash your head in or something. I think it's part of everyday life, you get some of that, you know, and I was asked by, you know, both my daughter and my mum, well, you know, you don't really put your true address, do you? On, you know, you don't really put that you live in Gosport down on your Facebook account, you know. And that's, well, yes, you know, and well, how stupid can you be, you know? And I said, well, is there anything else you lie about on your Facebook account? And they sort of said, well, no, not really, Dad, you know, but, well, other than age. And, oh, and the number of GCSEs I got. And these sorts of things. And my mum sort of said, well, I don't really, other than I put that I went to the Southampton University. And I said, you didn't go to Southampton University, Mum? And she said, well, yeah, but Dad did. You know, and so there's always a risk of this. It isn't just surveys. Now, you can check it with surveys to a degree, but there is always a risk of response. Sorry.
No, follow that. I mean, on Barbara's point, absolutely, but I know very little about designing surveys, and I would absolutely bow to the methodologists in ONS and elsewhere, NatSen and elsewhere, on the best way of doing that, but that sounds very sensible. I think the scanner data one is probably one of the three areas that ONS haven't got data, are trying hard to get data. It comes from, it's in our definition of big data, it's held outside government. So the other areas are obviously financial transactions and mobile phones. Now each of those is highly sensitive, and understandably and rightly we've got to be very cautious about how that's accessed and so on, and it's all held by commercial organisations. So I think absolutely yes, there's a lot being done, and you're right that we haven't published out and produced estimates based on scanner data, we would love to. So there's a lot of work going on there. Big data and kind of data held outside the system is kind of the big challenge.
Okay, thanks. Well, just before we move on and go up to have our refreshments and continue the discussion up there, I just wanted to ask Guy and Tom if there was any concluding remarks they wanted to make.
I mean, I would just say I actually don't think there's as much difference between the two viewpoints as you might imagine. And I think actually there is a sense of coming at it from slightly different angles, of course. And technology is a great enabler in all of this, of course, whether you're working on surveys or on other types of sources. So, I mean, I think, you know, it is this either or. You know, it's not either or, it is both. I suspect we want to push forward. The only issue, I think, is where that leaves the business case in the end. Because, you know, you are competing for resources and, you know, it becomes an expensive model. I mean, it's nice to do a census, the one that's coming up, and to be doing it both in a sort of traditional way, including use of the internet and doing administrative models and everything else. But it isn't a cheap model. And that, of course, is true if in the future we have surveys and we're doing a lot more work on administrative data and big data. There is an expense in there, and you know, we just need to be aware of that. Ideally, as a community, we want to do it all, I suspect.
And I think fundamentally, government, public sector should be about, in this space, providing infrastructure for others to use. So ONS is obviously primarily occupied with publishing data out, outputs around GDP and so on. But things like the Secure Research Service and supporting the administrative data research networks, and similarly supporting other users of the data. The infrastructure that you're producing out of admin data is not something you need to replicate once you've got that up and running. So it is a hard job to get that up and running. But once you're there, then surveys can keep plugging the gaps and so on. So I kind of leave it as that, and I think there's a lot of common ground, as Guy says, but a lot of opportunity out there as well. So thanks very much.
Okay, well, but let me just end by just thanking Guy and Tom again very much for what I think has been a very interesting evening, and just to say that there are drinks outside at the back, so I hope people will stay around for those. Thanks very much.
Thank you.